The observation deck of the asterisk Meridian crossing smelled faintly of recycled air, and something that might have been optimism 3 weeks ago, but had since curdled into exhausted politeness. Ethan Vale stood with his forehead pressed against the reinforced viewport, watching stars drift past like luminescent plankton, and wondered if it was professionally acceptable to fake a medical emergency, just to avoid another reception where humans and Kelthari smiled at each other with their teeth, and pretended that first contact wasn't essentially an elaborate exercise in mutual awkwardness. His drink, something the ship's synthesizer had optimistically labeled whiskey, despite tasting like regret filtered through a fuel cell, sat warming in his palm. 3 weeks into these negotiations, and he discovered that diplomatic vessels were essentially floating prisons where everyone was very polite about the fact that nobody could leave. The translation matrices were finally achieving 73% accuracy, which meant only every fourth sentence risked causing an interstellar incident. Progress, technically. The door hissed open behind him with the kind of hydraulic sigh that suggested even the asterisk Meridian crossing asterisk S machinery was tired of facilitating cultural exchange. Ethan didn't turn around immediately. If it was Deputy Minister Hawthorne coming to discuss budget allocations for xenolinguistic databases again, he was planning to simply walk into the viewport and hope vacuum was quicker than conversation. But the footsteps were wrong, lighter, with a rhythm that didn't match human gait patterns. He turned and forgot every carefully rehearsed greeting protocol he'd spent 6 months memorizing. Princess Selythe stood in the doorway, backlit by the corridor's bioluminescent strips, and Ethan's brain, trained in xenoanthropology, fluent in 4 human languages and 2 Kelthari dialects, generally considered quite functional, briefly forgot how to process visual information in any useful way. She was blue, not metaphorically, not in certain lights, but genuinely blue in the way Earth's oceans were blue before humanity finished polluting them. Her skin shifted in hue like deep water under changing light, darker at the edges and luminous where the observation deck's ambient glow caught her. Golden hair, not blonde, but actually metallic gold like someone had spun precious metal into something that moved like silk, fell past her shoulders in a style that seemed designed to draw attention to her ears. Those ears. They swept back from her temples in elegant curves, easily twice the length of human ears, tapering to delicate points that made Ethan think of ancient Earth mythology filtered through actual alien biology. Evolutionary adaptation for enhanced hearing, according to the Kelthari biological briefing documents. Striking architectural features that human aesthetic designers wish they could replicate, according to Ethan's brain, which had apparently decided to abandon professional objectivity entirely. She was also very clearly avoiding the reception 3 decks down, which immediately made her Ethan's favorite member of either delegation. The refreshments are terrible, aren't they? Her voice had that musical quality the translation matrices could never quite capture, like someone had taught a symphony to speak. I tried something called cheese. It was aggressive. Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. Aggressive cheese is actually a delicacy in some Earth regions. We're very proud of our hostile dairy products. Then I apologize for insulting your cultural heritage. She moved further into the observation deck, though Ethan noticed she kept to the shadows rather than the direct ambient lighting. I thought perhaps the view would be less exhausting than more conversations about atmospheric composition preferences. The stars are excellent listeners, very non-judgmental about translation errors. Yesterday, I accidentally told Ambassador Thelkarine that her negotiation style was like a beautiful fungus. Selythe's expression remained diplomatic, but something around her eyes suggested suppressed humor. The word for elegant and fungal are apparently very similar in human standard. Could have been worse. Last week I told a Kelthari delegate that his insights were as profound as furniture. Turns out the translation matrix interpreted my phrasing very literally. She did smile then, quick and genuine before diplomatic training reasserted itself. She moved to the viewport but positioned herself carefully in the darker section, where her reflection would be harder to see against the stars. Her fingers traced the edge of her glass, something purple that bioluminesced faintly, with the kind of precision that suggested she was focusing very hard on something that wasn't the conversation. They talked about safe things. The negotiations were progressing, technically. The translation matrices had stopped converting Kelthari idioms into nonsense about furniture mostly. The asterisk meridian crossing asterisk S environmental controls had finally found a temperature compromise that left both species only mildly uncomfortable, instead of actively suffering. Ethan described his quarters, which were designed for human proportions, and made him feel like he was living in a slightly oversized coffin. Sci-Fi mentioned that Kelthari ships were built with more vertical space, which meant she kept instinctively looking up in human vessels and feeling vaguely claustrophobic. But there was something underneath the careful small talk, a tension in how she held herself. She touched her ear twice, quick, self-conscious gestures she tried to disguise as adjusting her hair. Her position in the shadows seemed deliberate chosen. "Are you all right?" The question came out before Ethan's diplomatic training could rephrase it into something more professionally distant. "Of course." The response was automatic, perfectly neutral. Then, after a pause that lasted 3 heartbeats too long, "Human alcohol is weaker than Kelthari ceremonial drinks. I'm simply not accustomed to feeling so clear-headed at diplomatic functions." It was a deflection disguised as cultural observation, and they both knew it. Ethan watched her reflection ghost across the viewport, partial, uncertain, quickly dismissed as she angled herself further from the light. The silence stretched. Stars wheeled past. Somewhere 3 decks down, humans and Kelthari were making stilted small talk over carefully neutral beverages, and probably discussing atmospheric composition again, because it was safe territory that wouldn't accidentally cause incidents. When Sci-Fi finally spoke, she was staring at the stars rather than at him, her voice carrying that particular kind of quiet that usually preceded devastation. "I know I'm not as beautiful as human women." She said it casually, matter-of-factly, like mentioning an obvious truth. "I understand that must make these negotiations awkward for your delegation. I've seen the human aesthetic databases during preparation. I know what beauty looks like by your standards." Her hand moved toward her ear again, caught itself. "The ears are too long, the features too angular, the coloring too obviously alien. I just want you to know that I understand, so you don't have to pretend otherwise." Ethan's carefully trained diplomatic filters, 6 months of instruction on cultural sensitivity, appropriate professional boundaries, the critical importance of measured responses in cross-species contexts, disintegrated like tissue paper in vacuum. "You're wrong." Sci-Fi turned toward him, surprise breaking through diplomatic neutrality. "You're not beautiful like human women," Ethan continued, his brain screaming about protocols while his mouth kept talking, "because you're magnificent in ways human beauty doesn't even approach. Human beauty is constructed, curated, safe. Small parameters that everyone agrees on because anything outside them is threatening. What you have is drama, presence, visual impact that makes human aesthetics look timid and provincial by comparison." She was staring at him now with an expression he couldn't read, shock, maybe, or the kind of processing pause that happened when something didn't fit existing frameworks. "Your ears aren't too long, they're architectural. Human designers have been trying to replicate that kind of elegant proportion in aesthetic modifications for decades and failing, because they don't have the biological foundation to work from. Your coloring doesn't fail to meet human standards. It renders human skin tones monotonous. That blue has depth, variation, complexity. Human beauty is beige by comparison." He was going to get reprimanded for this, possibly reassigned, definitely violating several protocols about appropriate cultural commentary. Those features you think are too angular, they're striking. They have the kind of definition human faces lack. If you walked into a room on Earth, people would stop talking. Not because you're alien, because you have presence human beauty standards don't have vocabulary for. The silence that followed felt like free fall. Selaith stood frozen, her expression cycling through variations of shock that her diplomatic training couldn't quite suppress. Her reflection stared back at her from the viewport, and for the first time since entering the observation deck, she didn't immediately angle herself away from it. Ethan took a careful drink of his terrible synthesized whiskey and waited to see if he just caused a diplomatic incident or something else entirely. The stars wheeled past, indifferent to human protocols and Kelthari beauty standards, and the way First Contact kept finding new ways to complicate itself. Finally Selaith spoke, her voice quieter than before. Magnificent. Yes, not beautiful, magnificent. There's a difference. Ethan met her eyes golden, he noticed, like her hair, with depth that human irises couldn't match. Beautiful is safe, magnificent is something else. She turned back to the viewport, but this time she didn't hide in the shadows. Her reflection was clear against the stars, blue skin, golden hair, those elegant sweeping ears catching the ambient light. She studied it like she was seeing something new, reassessing with different criteria. I should return to the reception, she said eventually. Ambassador Thelkarine will wonder where I've gone. Probably, though she might just assume you're avoiding the aggressive cheese. That earned him another smile, briefer this time but somehow more genuine. She moved toward the door, then paused. Thank you for the reassessment. I didn't reassess anything. Just told you what was true. She studied him for a moment longer, expression complex and unreadable. Then she left, the door hissing shut behind her with that same exhausted hydraulic sigh. Ethan stood alone in the observation deck, looking at his reflection in the viewport. Human features, ordinary proportions, nothing particularly striking about any of it, and wondered if he just helped someone see themselves differently or simply destroyed his diplomatic career in the most spectacular way possible. Probably both. The stars continued wheeling past, still excellent listeners, still non-judgmental. Somewhere 3 decks down, First Contact was continuing with proper protocols and appropriate professional boundaries. Up here, Ethan finished his terrible whiskey and decided that magnificent was exactly the right word, whatever the professional consequences. Ethan spent the morning after the observation deck conversation running through disaster scenarios. 17 different versions of how badly he'd violated professional protocols, each one ending with him reassigned to cataloging atmospheric readings on mining stations, where the most complex cultural interaction involved asking someone to pass the synthetic protein bars. He'd rehearsed apologies, prepared explanations, and generally worked himself into a state of anxious certainty that the moment he saw Princess Selaith again, there would be awkwardness dense enough to collapse into a singularity. Instead, he found her in the cultural exchange seminar, looking different in a way that bypassed his trained observation skills and hit somewhere more instinctive. She wore the same formal Kelthari diplomatic attire, layered fabrics in deep purples that shifted with bioluminescent patterns when she moved. Her hair was arranged in the same intricate style, woven with metallic threads that caught the light. But something fundamental had shifted. She sat near the center of the room instead of her usual position in the back corner. When Ambassador Thelkarine activated the holographic display to present a comparison of Kelthari and human social hierarchies, Selaith leaned forward to examine the data projections, and her profile caught the full ambient lighting without any of those subtle adjustments Ethan had started cataloging unconsciously. The slight turn away, the hair positioned just so, the careful management of angles. 3 human delegates in the row ahead actually turned to look at her. Really look, not the polite diplomatic glances that acknowledged presence without engagement. One of them, a junior cultural attaché whose name Ethan could never remember, whispered something to her companion that might have been appreciative. Or surprised? Possibly both. Ethan tried to focus on the seminar content. Ambassador Thelkarine was explaining how Kelthari succession worked through demonstrated capability rather than birth order, which meant Princess Selythe's position as third heir could theoretically shift if she proved exceptional diplomatic skill during these negotiations. The holographic display showed family lineage in branching light patterns that made human family trees look embarrassingly two-dimensional. Ethan took notes with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he definitely wasn't watching Selythe ask questions from the center of the room with a confidence that seemed new, or at least newly visible. During the break, he successfully avoided her by developing a sudden fascination with the refreshment synthesizer's beverage options. The machine offered 47 varieties of liquids that all tasted essentially identical, but had culturally significant names. He was debating between Morning Clarity Infusion and Harmonious Awakening Blend, both of which would taste like slightly warm water with delusions of flavor, when a voice behind him observed that the human approach to beverage nomenclature was admirably optimistic. "It's aspirational," Ethan said without turning around, his finger hovering over the synthesizer's interface. "We name drinks after states we hope to achieve rather than states we're actually in." "Then I should try Diplomatic Breakthrough Elixir." Selythe reached past him to tap a selection. The synthesizer hummed and produced something that glowed faintly green, though I suspect it will taste like disappointment disguised as mint. "That's the human way, disappointing mint for everyone." She smiled at that, then took her glowing beverage and moved to the observation window that ran along the seminar room's far wall. After a moment's internal debate where his professional caution fought a brief, losing battle with his curiosity, Ethan followed. They stood watching the Meridian crossing S exterior maintenance drones perform their endless circuit of hull inspections. The little robots moved in precise formations, their work lights blinking in patterns that probably meant something to ship engineers and nothing to anyone else. "I've been thinking about vocabulary," Selythe said, her attention apparently focused on the drones rather than on Ethan. "How words shape perception. The translation matrices convert Kelthari aesthetic terms into human equivalents, but equivalence isn't accuracy. We have a word, Dulsara, that means something like presence that commands attention without effort. Your language translates it as striking, but that loses the nuance. Human aesthetic vocabulary is limited. We have beautiful, pretty, attractive, handsome, and about 15 variations that all mean roughly the same thing with minor contextual differences. And magnificent." She glanced at him then, expression neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she was testing the word's weight, which your language reserves for things like mountains and storms and other phenomena that don't fit smaller categories. "Generally, yes. We use it for things too impressive to be merely beautiful." I looked it up. In the linguistic database, the etymology traces back to words meaning great, grand, doing great things, not aesthetic at all originally. Ethan took a careful sip of his Morning Clarity Infusion, which tasted exactly like warm water with confused ambitions. Language evolves, meanings shift, though I suppose the original sense still applies, magnificent as doing something impressive rather than simply being pleasant to look at. "So when you said I was magnificent rather than beautiful, you meant I do something impressive." Her tone was curious, analytical, the way she sounded during negotiations when she was working through a complex cultural translation. "I meant you have presence that makes beautiful seem inadequate as a descriptor. Impressive, certainly, but also that trying to measure you by beauty standards is using the wrong scale entirely." One of the maintenance drones drifted past the observation window, its work lights creating brief prismatic effects across Selythe's features. She watched it pass, then said quietly, "I spent this morning trying to see myself the way you described. It's harder than expected, recalibrating assessment criteria after weeks of comparison." Progress isn't usually comfortable. No, she turned from the window to face him directly. But today, when Ambassador Thelkarine complimented my handling of the territorial designation discussion, I didn't immediately wonder if it was compensatory kindness for my appearance. That's new. Before Ethan could respond, the seminar chime indicated the break was ending. Delegates began drifting back to their seats. Sel returned to her center room position, and Ethan found himself in the back row, watching the afternoon session unfold while trying not to be obvious about watching her engage with the material without those small self-conscious adjustments he'd cataloged before. The days developed a rhythm after that. Selythe began wearing her hair in styles that emphasized her ears rather than managing them, intricate braids that incorporated metallic threads, and positioned everything to catch light rather than diffuse it. She participated more actively in joint sessions, and Ethan noticed other delegates starting to actually listen, rather than simply waiting politely for their turn to speak. During a presentation on comparative artistic traditions, she stood at the front of the room under full lighting while discussing Kelthari aesthetic philosophy, explaining how their art prioritized emotional impact over representational accuracy. "We value the feeling a piece creates more than its technical precision," she said, gesturing at holographic examples of Kelthari sculpture that seemed to shift and flow despite being solid matter. Human art appears to emphasize skill demonstration, showing the artist's capability. Kelthari art emphasizes the viewer's experience. One of the human delegates, the cultural attaché who'd noticed Selythe earlier, asked if that philosophical difference extended to personal aesthetics. Selythe paused, considered, then said yes, in ways that made direct translation difficult. Kelthari evaluated appearance based on presence and impact rather than symmetry or proportion. The human delegate nodded thoughtfully, and Ethan watched several other faces shift into expressions that suggested recalibration. Their own interactions developed new dimensions. Selythe sought him out during breaks, and their conversations ranged across topics that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocols. He learned about her childhood on Kelthara Prime, where she'd been third heir in a family that didn't expect her to approach the succession, which meant she'd had freedom her older siblings lacked. She'd studied xenobiology because it interested her rather than because it was politically advantageous, right up until first contact made it extremely politically advantageous, and suddenly she was the obvious choice to lead negotiations. She learned about his Mars colony upbringing, where he developed an obsession with xenolinguistics that his parents called impractical with increasing volume, until first contact made it the most valuable specialty in human space. He'd expected to spend his career analyzing theoretical alien communication systems. Instead, he'd gotten actual aliens to communicate with, and the reality was considerably messier than the theory. Theory never includes the part where you accidentally compliment someone using the word for fungus, Selythe observed, or where you have to explain that aggressive cheese is culturally significant. I'm still not convinced about the cheese. I think humans are collectively engaged in a culinary dare. That's not inaccurate, actually. Half of human cuisine is essentially showing off about what we can make edible through sufficient stubbornness. She laughed at that, genuine and unguarded, and Ethan's linguist brain immediately started analyzing its tonal structure while the rest of him just appreciated the sound. The shift in their dynamic became obvious during a tour of the Asterisk Meridian, crossing Asterisk-S observation gardens, a hydroponics section where Earth and Kelthari plants coexisted in carefully maintained environmental zones. Selythe stood among bioluminescent Kelthari ferns that cast shifting light patterns across her skin, creating effects that made the carefully cultivated earth orchids nearby look static and dull by comparison. "Did you mean it?" She asked the question while examining a fern's fractal structure, not looking at him directly. "What you said on the observation deck, or was it diplomatic kindness to make me feel better?" Ethan moved closer, watching how the fern light played across her features like living jewelry. Look at yourself right now, in this light, with those plants doing their bioluminescent thing specifically because you're standing near them. They respond to body heat, did you know that? Kelthari plants evolved to react to presence. He gestured at the effect she was creating simply by existing. Human women would need 3 hours of preparation and professional lighting designers to create what you're producing accidentally. Does that answer the question? She looked down at the ferns, then at her reflection in the garden's observation glass. Blue skin illuminated by living light, golden eyes catching the glow, ears outlined in luminescence. I think I'm starting to believe you meant it. Progress, terrifying progress. But she smiled when she said it and made no move to step away from the light. They walked back through the gardens in comfortable silence, passing earth roses that seemed almost aggressively ordinary next to the plants that glowed and shifted and responded to presence. At the exit, Sci-Fi paused. Thank you for the vocabulary adjustment. You're welcome, though technically I just pointed out what was already there. Words matter, especially to someone who spent weeks measuring themselves by the wrong dictionary. The seminar chime sounded somewhere in the distance, calling them back to negotiations and protocols and appropriate professional boundaries. But for a moment, they stood in the garden threshold, surrounded by plants that proved beauty could be dramatic and living, and entirely outside any standard's comfortable parameters. Then Sci-Fi returned to being a diplomatic representative, and Ethan returned to being a cultural specialist, and they both pretended that magnificent wasn't becoming the most important word in either of their vocabularies. The reception celebrating preliminary progress toward a cultural exchange agreement had transformed the Asterisk Meridian, crossing Asterisk's main hall, into what Ethan privately considered a masterclass in diplomatic set design. Earth's minimalist aesthetic, clean lines, neutral surfaces, lighting that suggested efficiency without personality, collided with Kelthari preferences for layered textures and bioluminescent accents. The result looked like someone had asked 2 different species to decorate the same space without consulting each other, which was essentially what had happened. Ethan navigated the room's political geography with practiced care. Deputy Minister Hawthorne lurked near the refreshment tables, probably waiting to ambush someone about budget allocations. Ambassador Okafor held court near the main viewport, surrounded by delegates who actually understood why these negotiations mattered beyond checking boxes on diplomatic itineraries. The food, a hybrid spread of human and Kelthari offerings, included items that glowed faintly and others that looked aggressively beige, sometimes on the same plate. He was debating whether synthesized canapés counted as real food or merely food-adjacent performance art when he heard the conversation that stopped him mid-step. 3 human delegates stood partially screened by decorative panels that someone had positioned for aesthetic purposes without considering acoustic properties. Junior diplomatic staff, young enough that they probably thought they were being discreet, speaking in the kind of casual tones people used when they believed they had privacy. It's unfortunate the Kelthari sent her as their primary representative. The first voice belonged to someone Ethan vaguely recognized from trade negotiation sessions. I mean, negotiations might go smoother with someone less visually jarring. I've been trying to be polite, the second delegate agreed, but those ears are genuinely distracting. And the blue skin in certain lights is almost unsettling, makes it hard to focus on what she's actually saying. The third voice, slightly more diplomatic in tone if not in content, suggested, perhaps Kelthari beauty standards are just different. She might be considered attractive by her own people's metrics, even if she doesn't register that way for us. Ethan's training in diplomatic protocols, 6 months of instruction on appropriate responses, professional conduct, maintaining productive relationships even under provocation, prepared him for this moment by immediately abandoning him entirely. What his training didn't account for was the angle that let him see what the delegates couldn't. Princess Selythe standing on the other side of the decorative panel, close enough that she'd heard every word. Her expression maintained perfect diplomatic neutrality, the kind of controlled blankness that years of training could produce, but Ethan had spent enough time with her now to read underneath it. The slight tightening around her eyes, the way her hand moved toward her ear before she caught herself and lowered it, the infinitesimal shift in her posture that suggested she was preparing to simply walk away, to pretend she hadn't heard, to absorb this as confirmation of suspicions she'd been carrying. His response bypassed every protocol he'd ever learned. Ethan stepped around the panel directly into the delegate's line of sight and asked, loud enough that nearby conversations paused, "Are you genuinely so limited by human aesthetic parameters that you can't recognize magnificence when it's standing in the same room?" All three delegates startled like they'd been electrically shocked. One started to stammer something that might have become an excuse. Ethan didn't give them the chance. Princess Selythe's features possess the kind of dramatic elegance that human beauty standards are too timid to even attempt. Her coloring has depth and variation that makes human skin tones look flat by comparison. I've seen paint swatches with more complexity than most human complexions. Those ears you find distracting. He was vaguely aware that more people were turning to watch now, that this was definitely going to have consequences. They're architectural features that human aesthetic designers have been trying and failing to replicate in body modifications for decades. We can't achieve that kind of elegant proportion because we don't have the biological foundation. One delegate, recovering slightly, tried to interject that they were simply making observations, that surely Ethan understood. "I understand that you're cataloging someone's features like deficiencies, while demonstrating nothing except the limitations of your own aesthetic education." Ethan was aware his voice had risen, that Ambassador Okafor had appeared at the edge of his peripheral vision, wearing an expression somewhere between alarm and suppressed amusement. If you're going to engage in cultural exchange, you might start by developing enough aesthetic sophistication to recognize that beauty standards are provincial constructs, but magnificence is a category that transcends them. The stammering delegate tried again, suggesting that Ethan was being inappropriate, that they'd been speaking privately, that he couldn't actually find the princess attractive by human standards. Human standards are inadequate measuring tools. The words came out sharp enough to cut. "I find Princess Selythe magnificent by the only standards that matter, the ones that recognize actual aesthetic impact rather than provincial comfort. She has presence, drama, visual weight that human beauty standards don't even have vocabulary for. And if you can't see that, you might consider whether you're actually qualified for positions that require cross-cultural awareness." Ambassador Okafor chose that moment to intervene with the kind of smooth diplomatic skill that came from decades of practice. She suggested this might be an excellent opportunity for enhanced cultural sensitivity, training on the dangers of applying single-species aesthetic frameworks in multi-species contexts. The delegates retreated with varying levels of embarrassment and poorly concealed resentment. The reception slowly resumed its previous rhythm, though several people kept glancing toward Ethan with expressions that ranged from approval to concern about his professional future. He became aware that his hands were shaking slightly. Also that he'd just violated roughly 17 different protocols about appropriate conduct, professional boundaries, and maintaining productive relationships with colleagues. His career trajectory had probably just taken a sharp turn toward cataloging atmospheric data on mining stations, where the most complex interaction involved nodding at people in corridors. Worth it, though. That was remarkably unprofessional. Selythe's voice came from behind him, carefully neutral in a way that made it impossible to determine her actual reaction. Ethan turned to find her standing close enough that she'd obviously witnessed the entire incident. Her expression was complex: surprise, Something that might have been gratitude, possible embarrassment that he'd heard the same conversation she had. And underneath it all, that look she got when processing something that didn't fit her existing frameworks. Extremely unprofessional, he agreed. I'll probably face formal reprimand, possibly reassignment, definitely a lengthy conversation about appropriate diplomatic conduct. But you defended my magnificence like it was objective fact, worth risking professional consequences over. It is objective fact, and they were cataloging your features like deficiencies while you stood there understanding every word. That made me angry in ways that definitely violated professional detachment. She studied him for a long moment, her golden eyes reflecting the reception's hybrid lighting. I've been called beautiful as diplomatic courtesy, pretty as patronizing kindness, exotic as fetishization disguised as compliment. But watching someone defend my magnificence with genuine fury, willing to damage their career over it, that was new. You deserved defending. Perhaps. A small smile crossed her features, though I suspect your diplomatic supervisors will disagree about the methodology. Probably worth it anyway. The reception continued around them, delegates from both species engaging in carefully pleasant conversations about safe topics. Someone had successfully synthesized something that approximated Kael'thari ceremonial beverages, which meant several humans would probably spend tomorrow discovering that their digestive systems were not prepared for cross-species alcohol. The bioluminescent decorations pulsed in patterns that were meant to be soothing, but mostly made the room look like it was breathing. I should circulate, Selaith said eventually. Ambassador Thelkarin expects me to engage with the trade delegation representatives. Diplomatic responsibilities. Yes, she paused, then added quietly, thank you for the defense and for being angry on my behalf. Both were appreciated, even if the second was professionally inadvisable. Professional advisability is overrated. That earned him a genuine smile, brief but real, before she moved back into the diplomatic circulation. Ethan watched her navigate conversations with confidence that seemed more natural now, less carefully constructed, and wondered if that was progress or just his own wishful interpretation. Ambassador Akafir appeared at his elbow holding 2 glasses of something that glowed faintly purple. That was quite a performance. I know, I'll accept whatever reprimand. Oh, you're definitely getting a formal conversation about appropriate conduct and professional boundaries. She handed him one of the glowing drinks. But off the record, sometimes protocols need disrupting, and if one is going to violate professional distance, defending an allied princess's dignity isn't the worst possible cause. She paused, took a sip of her drink, made a face that suggested it tasted exactly as questionable as it looked. Those 3 will submit formal complaints. You'll need to issue carefully worded apologies about your tone while making absolutely no apology for the content. I can do that. I know, that's why I'm not actually worried. She gave him a look that was part mentor, part warning. But Ethan, next time you decide to publicly defend someone's magnificence, maybe give me 30 seconds warning so I can position myself for optimal intervention timing. Noted. She drifted away to continue managing diplomatic relationships and preventing further incidents. Ethan stood holding his questionable purple beverage, watching Selaith engage with a group of human trade representatives who seemed to actually be listening to her with new attention, and decided that even if this entire incident ended his diplomatic career, watching her stand in that conversation with confidence instead of careful self-consciousness made it worthwhile. The 3 delegates who'd started this appeared near the exit, clearly leaving early. One of them glanced back towards Selaith with an expression that might have been reassessment or might have been residual embarrassment. Ethan raised his glowing beverage in their direction in a gesture that was absolutely not a salute and definitely not professional. Ambassador Akafir from across the room shook her head with an expression that clearly said she saw that and he was impossible. Fair assessment, really. The reception continued, humanity and Kelthari engaging in cultural exchange with varying degrees of success. Somewhere in the diplomatic complexity, progress was probably happening. Ethan finished his terrible purple drink. Decided magnificence was still exactly the right word regardless of professional consequences, and went to see if the synthesizer could produce something that tasted less like glowing regret. The formal reprimand arrived the morning after the reception incident, delivered via the *Meridian crossing *S message system, with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested multiple administrators had worked through the night drafting appropriately stern language. Ethan read it over synthesized coffee that tasted like ambition without follow-through, and decided that conduct unbecoming a diplomatic representative was actually underselling what he'd done. Spectacular violation of professional protocols while defending alien magnificence would have been more accurate, if less bureaucratically appropriate. Ambassador Akafor summoned him to her office, a space that managed to be both cramped and austere, decorated with nothing except a wall display showing Earth from orbit and a plant that was definitely dying despite the ship's environmental controls. She gestured at the chair across from her desk with the kind of precision that suggested she'd practiced the movement specifically for intimidating subordinates. "That," she said, pulling up a holographic recording of last night's incident, "was perhaps the most aggressively unprofessional thing I've witnessed in 30 years of diplomatic service." "Yes, ma'am. It was also," she continued, freezing the hologram at the moment Ethan had asked if the delegates were genuinely that limited by human aesthetic parameters, possibly necessary. "Though I will deny saying that if anyone asks, and you will never mention this conversation existed." Ethan blinked, understood. "You'll issue formal apologies to the 3 delegates for your tone, not your content, your tone. You will express regret for the public nature of your response and acknowledge that a private conversation would have been more appropriate. You will not, under any circumstances, apologize for defending Princess Selithe's appearance or for suggesting that human aesthetic standards are provincial." She deactivated the hologram. "The Kelthari delegation has also filed paperwork requesting that you provide input for all future cultural sensitivity training sessions. Ambassador Thelkarine apparently found your assessment of cross-species aesthetic frameworks refreshingly direct." "That's unexpected." "Yes, well, apparently accidentally insulting the Kelthari heir apparent has consequences that extend beyond your immediate career trajectory." Akafor's expression softened slightly. "You're not actually in serious trouble, Ethan, mostly because Princess Selithe herself submitted a formal statement saying your intervention prevented a significant diplomatic incident by addressing unconscious bias that would have undermined future negotiations. Though between us, I suspect she just wanted to ensure you didn't face consequences for defending her." The conversation ended with Ethan still employed but officially reprimanded, which felt like the diplomatic equivalent of being grounded with permission to leave the house. He spent the rest of the morning drafting carefully worded non-apologies to the 3 delegates, each one expressing regret for public confrontation while making absolutely no concession about content. The afternoon brought a shift in the negotiations themselves. Princess Selithe, during a session on cultural exchange protocols, pointed out an assumption nobody had explicitly stated but everyone had internalized, that Kelthari representatives would naturally adapt to human aesthetic contexts rather than vice versa. She phrased it with perfect diplomatic language, but the underlying challenge was unmistakable. Why was human comfort treated as the default setting? Why did adaptation flow in only one direction? Ethan watched several human delegates have visible moments of realization. Ambassador Akafor immediately proposed revisions to ensure aesthetic and cultural adaptation efforts were genuinely mutual. Deputy Minister Hawthorne, who'd witnessed the reception incident from a safe distance, suggested that perhaps the human delegation should participate in Kelthari aesthetic tradition demonstrations as learners rather than observers. The session transformed from standard negotiation into something more fundamental, a recognition that first contact required questioning assumptions neither side knew they were making. During the break, Sci-Fi found him examining the refreshment synthesizer's options with deep skepticism. The harmonious understanding blend tastes like water that's disappointed in itself, he said without looking up. I tried cultural bridge infusion yesterday. It tasted like apology. Accurate probably. He selected something called mutual respect brew and received liquid that was aggressively neutral. I got formally reprimanded this morning. I know, I submitted a statement on your behalf. Ambassador Akafer mentioned that. Thank you, though you didn't have to. You defended my magnificence at professional cost. Sci-Fi obtained her own beverage, something that bioluminesced faintly green. The least I could do was ensure the cost wasn't permanent career damage. They moved to the observation window, overlooking the Asterisk Meridian, crossing Asterisk-S docking bay, where maintenance crews were preparing shuttles for the eventual return journey to Kelthari space. The preliminary agreements would be signed soon, which meant these negotiations were approaching their conclusion. Success, technically, though Ethan found himself less focused on diplomatic achievements and more on the fact that success meant ending this artificial proximity. The observation deck conversation feels like it happened months ago, Sci-Fi said, watching the maintenance crews work in synchronized patterns. When I admitted I wasn't beautiful by human standards, and you told me I was magnificent instead. I expected polite disagreement, diplomatic reassurance that would confirm what I'd said while pretending not to. Instead, you redefined the entire framework. You were using the wrong measuring system. Yes, but I'd been using it for weeks, comparing myself to human aesthetic databases, understanding that I would never register as attractive by those parameters, wondering if that made these negotiations harder. She took a sip of her glowing beverage, made a face that suggested it tasted like regret. Then you said magnificent, and that word shifted something fundamental, not just about how I saw myself, but about what measures mattered. You're the one who started presenting differently. I just provided vocabulary. Words shape perception, especially when spoken with conviction by someone who sees what others miss. She turned from the window to face him directly. Standing behind that decorative panel, hearing those delegates catalog my features as deficiencies, for a moment, I was back in my quarters with human aesthetic databases, understanding that I would never be beautiful by those standards. But then I heard your voice, fierce and unapologetic, defending my magnificence like it was objective truth worth fighting for. It was objective truth. Yes, but watching you risk professional consequences to defend something most humans couldn't even see taught me whose assessment actually matters. She paused, seemed to be working through something. I've been called beautiful as diplomatic courtesy, pretty as patronizing kindness, exotic as fetishization. But magnificent, that was recognition of actual presence rather than careful compliment. And watching you defend it publicly made me understand. You weren't being diplomatic. You were being honest. Ethan set down his mutual respect brew, which tasted like disappointing water with aspirations. My behavior probably violated several protocols about professional objectivity. Protocols are useful until they prevent people from saying true things. Sci-Fi's expression shifted, became something more vulnerable than diplomatic neutrality usually allowed. So I need to know, do you actually find me magnificent, or were you defending a principle? The question hung between them with the weight of everything they'd been carefully not addressing. Below them, maintenance crews continued their work, oblivious to conversations happening in observation windows above their heads. Watching you walk into diplomatic sessions now, Ethan said carefully, seeing you present yourself with confidence instead of careful minimization, noticing how you've stopped making those self-conscious adjustments to hide features you've decided to emphasize instead. Yes, I find you magnificent. More so because you're starting to see it yourself. The silence that followed felt weighted with possibilities. Somewhere in the distance, the seminar chime indicated the break was ending. Neither of them moved. This complicates things, Selaith observed finally, significantly. I'm supposed to be demonstrating diplomatic skill to prove succession eligibility. You're supposed to be maintaining professional objectivity as a cultural specialist. We're both technically failing at professional distance. Spectacularly failing. She smiled at that, quick and genuine. The preliminary agreements will be signed in 3 days. Then the * meridian crossing returns to Kelthari space, and I'll have proved my diplomatic capability. You'll have completed your cultural specialist assignment. And then we'll both have decisions to make about what happens next. Yes. She studied her reflection in the observation window, blue skin, golden hair, those elegant ears catching the light without any self-consciousness now. Whether this was a first contact connection that flourished in artificial proximity but fades with distance, or something that translates across the space between our worlds. Significant decisions. Made more complicated by the fact that I'm starting to believe I'm magnificent, which is entirely your fault. I accept full responsibility for your improved self-assessment. The seminar chime sounded again, more insistent. They returned to the afternoon session, where Ambassador Thelkarine was presenting revised proposals for mutual cultural adaptation that acknowledged aesthetic standards as bilateral concerns rather than universal measures. Ethan took notes while trying not to obviously watch Selaith engage with the material, and failed at both with roughly equal success. The signing ceremony 3 days later transformed the main hall into something that actually looked intentionally designed rather than accidentally collaborative. The * meridian crossing *S crew had managed lighting that genuinely flattered both species, decorative elements that felt coherent instead of conflicting, and seating arrangements that suggested someone had finally figured out spatial preferences for human and Kelthari delegates. Princess Selaith stood at the front of the assembled delegations in full traditional Kelthari attire, layered ceremonial fabrics that incorporated bioluminescent threads, her hair woven with metallic elements that caught every light source, and jewelry adorning her ears in ways that emphasized rather than minimized them. She was radiant, striking, impossible to look away from, and when she delivered her formal remarks about genuine cultural exchange requiring mutual adaptation and questioning of all assumptions, the applause from both delegations sounded authentic rather than merely polite. Ethan stood in the human delegation section, watching her own that space with absolute confidence, and thought about how she'd looked that first night on the observation deck, positioned in shadows, touching her ear self-consciously, admitting she knew she wasn't beautiful by human standards while expecting polite disagreement. The difference between then and now wasn't just confidence. It was fundamental recalibration of what measures mattered. After the ceremony, as delegates celebrated with beverages that still tasted questionable, but at least now had the excuse of being celebratory, Ethan found himself back on the observation deck where this had started. The stars wheeled past in their endless rotation, indifferent to human protocols and Kelthari succession politics, and the way first contact kept complicating itself in unexpected ways. Thinking about magnificent futures. Selaith's voice came from the doorway, thinking about how you're standing in direct light instead of shadows. She moved to join him at the viewport, her reflection clear and unobscured against the stars. I'm claiming the word for myself now, making it mine rather than just accepting your assessment. Good, that's what it was meant for. They stood in comfortable silence, watching maintenance drones begin their post-ceremony work. Tomorrow the * meridian crossing would begin its journey back to Kelthari space. The preliminary agreements would move forward. Success, by every diplomatic measure. We still have decisions to make, Selythe said eventually, about what happens when artificial proximity ends. We do. I think, she paused, seemed to be working through phrasing. I think if we can manage first contact between species, we can probably manage connection across interstellar distances. Probably, magnificently even. She smiled, reclaiming the word with absolute certainty. After all, someone taught me that the right vocabulary at the right moment can redefine everything, including what's possible. Ethan looked at her reflection in the viewport, blue skin luminous against stars, golden eyes bright with confidence that was no longer carefully constructed but genuinely owned, those elegant ears adorned with ceremonial jewelry that caught light like captured stars, and thought that magnificent didn't even begin to cover it. But it was still exactly the right word.